Go. Okay. You tell me when to go live? It's going live already? Oh, it is? Okay. You sent it to them? Okay, good morning. So continuing from last week, I began speaking about Seder Hishtalshilus, which is sometimes referred to as the cosmic order. Seder as an order, and cosmic as covering all the cosmos, all the levels, Maila Maila Ad Lamata Mata, from the highest to the lowest. And it's essentially really the framework and the very fabric of what structure means. You see, when before you learn Chassidus, or in general before you think about ruchnistic matters, spiritual matters, we look at the world is a structured world. There's nothing that appears not structured. Everything. Daimim, Tsemeya, Chaim, Medaber, Zman, Mokim, time, space, Mailo, Mato, Kdimo, Ichur. Everything has its place. And this is both in the macrocosm of the entire world and entire universe, every planet, the sky, the earth, water, land, and also in the microcosm, which is the human being, that our entire being is based on structure. If you in any way would suspend the structure or somewhat compromise it, that would be called destruction. Because if you eliminate the structure in any way, God forbid, if food goes down the windpipe, for example, that can be dangerous. If water suddenly crosses its boundary and floods the earth like a tsunami, that's destructive. So everything we know is based on structure. The reason I'm making this point is because a big part of understanding Chassidus and learning it is to realize that we're being introduced to new dimensions of reality and higher levels of consciousness that allow us to look beyond just structure. And it's important to state, because when you don't know the hagbolas that we have, let's call it the stereotypes, or the limited perspective we have on our own, you sometimes try to fit the new ideas into your old framework. That's the nature of a human being. You learn something new, you fit it into your structure. I think I mentioned this once. It was one of the mashpim in the Torah. He heard me speak about something, and I said, we have to learn how to teach children, or the young students, I should say, when they start learning Chassidus, to realize that Chassidus is not nigla. You know, a guy told me once, a shliach, who's an educated guy, so I said, so what have you learned in yeshiva? He tells me, I learned Lamites Malachas and Esses Sfiras, all in one breath. Like a bunch of numbers, 39 Malachas, 10 Sfiras. So this mashpia called me, he said, would I mind giving a type of introductory talk to the Talmidim, Mesifta, 15-year-olds. Is that Mesifta? I don't even remember. Shir Aleph, I don't even know I'm a long time away from that part of my life. But a component, say, came to my house, he brought around 20 guys, maybe 25. They're sitting at my table, so I decided to do an experiment. Let's do it with an experiment, a demonstration. So I went and took out an apple from the refrigerator, and I put it on the table. And I said to the Bachrim, I said, so tell me, how many apples could fit on this table? So there's smart guys, and they said, okay, let's measure the apple. The apple is 2 inches, whatever it is. Then let's estimate the size of the table. And how many apples fit on the table? 500 apples, 400 apples, it doesn't even matter. The point is, there's a certain amount that can fit on the table. So then I said to them, let's another question. How many ideas and concepts can fit in your brain? Remember, a brain is like the size a little more larger than the palm of my hand. A brain fits in your head here. A brain is smaller than the table. And so how many ideas can fit into in your brain? So obviously they didn't think about it. They right away went into, they started saying, okay, so I said, so how big is an idea? If an apple's 2 inches, how about an idea? So they never thought about conceptual space or time because no one ever brought it up to them. And children don't think like that. Children think in very tangible terms. So then took a little while for them to figure out that an idea doesn't occupy space as in inches or feet. And the brain, even though it's a physical brain, it's not just ideas fitting into a brain like apples on a table or a bottle of milk in a refrigerator, but rather that the brain can occupy, and no one even knows the number. Is it billions of ideas? Is it trillions of ideas? No one even knows. All the scientists in the world still don't know. Some say it's almost unlimited. Can't say it's infinite, but it's definitely beyond. So how do you explain that? So you're forced to suddenly understand what's called mokim ruchni, spiritual space, or conceptual space. And that alone tells you that Esses Sfiris and Lamites Malachas are not the same thing. Because then you start thinking about mokim Zman in a different way. Now, it's still not easy to understand. In Ayin Beis, I don't know if any of you have come to this, there's a very powerful statement that the Alter Rebbe Rashab writes, that b'seichleinu efshar lahovin inyan shalamayla mimokim. That's what he says. We can't really understand something that's higher than space. Chassidus talks all the time about lamayla mimokim and lamayla mizman. Yeah, we can talk about it, and we can, through Yediyas HaShlilik, we can try to figure it out. But Ne'efer Chiyuvi, to say what means something that doesn't occupy space is very hard to fully, and that's what he writes. Now the same thing with Zman. We all know the question, why was the world not created earlier? Why was it created? Tovshin Pei Bei Shana, Lifnei, 5,782 years ago. So the classic answer brought to Chassidus from the Magid of Mizrich is that Zman Zanivre. And there was no before. So before Breishis Bara Lakim, you can't ask before, there was no before. Now can you wrap your head around that? Can you tell me what it was like a second before Breishis Bara, and no, there's no before. We don't have a concept of no before. So we say it in words, and it sounds like a good answer, but can you really? In other words, could you have existed before Breishis Bara? Obviously not, because there's no before, so there's nothing there. But at the same time, we say that the Eibishter precedes creation. Atahu Kedem Shenivra Elam, Atahu Misha Nivra Elam. So obviously, Kedem doesn't mean in Zman, it means in concept. My point is that this olive base of Chassidus, until you're really challenged, we take it for granted. You start learning Maimorim, you don't realize that we're fitting all these Inyanim Ruchnim into our musik, our concept of Zman and Mokim, which is natural. But the point is the exact opposite. The whole point of Chassidus is to be mafshit and to help us get beyond our limited time and space. So when we say, for example, Hayomim E'elin Niskarim V'Nasim, or that Rosh Hashanah every year recreates what happened the first Rosh Hashanah, that's L'mayla Mizman. Because Zman, once something passed yesterday, it doesn't exist today, in general. Yesterday is yesterday. You can never return back to yesterday. And yet, Torah Chassidus talk about recreating what was there a year ago, 2 years ago, all the way back. That Zman is like a spiral. So when you look Chassidus, you start understanding Zman and Mokim in a different way. So I go back to what I said before about Seder Hishtalshilus. Seder Hishtalshilus is really the essence and the framework, as I said, of our understanding of existence. It's the structure. And the structure that the Eibishter created. It's not a dimyon, it's not an illusion, and it's meant to be, there's real purpose to it. But never think that's where it begins. That's why there's a whole discussion about Lifnei Tzimtzum and L'mayla Seder Hishtalshilus and Lifnei Seder Hishtalshilus to tell us that Seder Hishtalshilus is a creation. Just like Breishis Bara Lakim is a structure. And every day Yom Rishon, and Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. Every day has its kol yema v'yema over the vidita. What happened on Sunday didn't happen on Monday. And over zmanei batel karbonei, meaning that every day has a time, and it's negay even halacha. You can't bring a korban yesterday for today. You can't daven today for yesterday. So there's real hagbolas al pitera, not just because we're limited. That's the way the Eibishter wanted it. He wanted a structure. But at the same time, understanding the structure, Seder Hishtalshilus, in context of something that's higher is the key, because ultimately the goal is going to be the yichud and the chibur of uniting and integrating these two realities. Because unless we do that, we ultimately don't have a relationship with the Eibishter. Because the Eibishter, even though he created Hishtalshilus, and as I've emphasized many times, that is his rotzen. So it's a rotzen atzmi, and it has all those milas, but he wants us to connect to the milah mised Hishtalshilus. So everything ultimately comes down to connecting the pratim of the structure of our existence with that which is higher than pratim. I just wanted to give that overview, and I'll give an example why this is so important. I talked before about the structure of the earth, of the universe, and the structure of the human being. Because always mipsari echzel lekah is the best mashal of all, because it's right before you. Your flesh, from my flesh I behold God. From your very flesh, meaning from your structure of your being, you can understand the Eibishter. So what do we see, even without even deep understanding of things, what do you see when you look at a healthy human body? So the truth is, if you think about it, it's a complete paradox. On one hand, as I just described in detail, your being, your very physical body could not be healthy if it didn't have a structure. If the brain and the heart got all mixed together, and the liver and the kidneys and the lungs, and things did not do their job, and they suddenly decided, let's have an organ conference, and we're all going to unite and become one, you have destruction. That would be not healthy. Every part of the body has to do its part. You put a piece of food in your mouth, so when you first put it in the mouth, you have to first chew it and break down the food, then it goes down your esophagus, down your throat, then through the digestive system. It's a whole process. And the digestive system expels the waste and retains the nutrients and turns it into blood. The blood is oxygenized by the lungs. The blood also has to circulate. You breathe in and out, and then you have to eliminate again from the blood the bad stuff and retain the good. I mean, it's a whole process. Most of us are not even familiar with it. We just know, we take it for granted. In any one step, it doesn't work in the right way. If the structure somewhat gets compromised, we know it can be dangerous. On the other hand, you see a fascinating thing. Everything works together in the most coordinated way. Because if you think each thing, the heart and the brain, or the lungs and the liver, or the other parts of your body, if they're so unique, and they are unique, they're completely different. If someone didn't know what a human being looked like, a Martian came to this earth and saw a dissected body, a bunch of organs, ramach evorim, and not put together, you'd never know you can put them together in one machine. And here in the human body, again, a healthy human body, they all work together as if someone's talking to each one of them like a conductor of a symphony. That's perfect, seamless harmony. And that too is critical. In other words, both their prat, the Hishtalshilus that they have, and their Hishtalshilus, and those are two words that I'm intentionally using because those are the two words that define Hishtalshilus in the best possible way. The distinction they have, and at the same time they're working together, which is a paradox. Try to do it. Look, anyone that manages a company knows how hard it is to get different people aligned toward one objective. Ain't they saying shovavas? You could have arguments, disagreements, even if it's not a fight. People have different ways of looking at things. Try it out. Try to bring together 5 intelligent people and try to create a harmony. It's not so simple. Again, even if there's no negative feelings, because people are different. That's how it is. That's why it's so difficult. I read somewhere, someone said, what is the biggest achievement today in technology? Everybody thinks the answer would be internet, websites, all these technologies. And someone said no. They wrote that the most biggest chiddush today is FedEx and UPS, if you wish, now Amazon. Why? Because technology, it's a matter of figuring out how to program something that it should work well. But it's a program, there's no bchira. Once you program something, the program doesn't talk back to you. When FedEx has to ship millions of packages a day, and it has to be delivered by hand, that means you have to coordinate all the pickups, all the deliveries, all the travel, and you're dealing with literally hundreds of thousands of people. And to have that work in a way that almost every package is delivered on time, that's considered one of the biggest feats in modern times. Because you're dealing with humans. And once it's humans, to get them all to work together, not because they don't want to work together, but it's just a fact. You know, this one comes a minute late, then the whole assembly line is affected. It's interesting. So the point I'm making here is that the key to Hishtalshilus is, on one hand, there's Chalkus, that like what is in the human body, everything in its mokim and its place, and everything has to do what it has to do. If for example, as I mentioned before, if the windpipe wouldn't close as the food is about to go down your throat, that's dangerous. So how does it know how to close? And if it doesn't open afterwards, you can't breathe. So how does it know to do all this? And just one example among millions. And especially when you think of the DNA and the genetic makeup. So what you find is this fascinating paradox that on one hand there's a tremendous structure, on the other hand there's a tremendous coordination and yichud. And that is critical because if you go one or the other, you don't have a dira b'tachtenim. If you only had tachtenim, loshen rabim, and only ischalkus, you wouldn't have Hashem echad. You wouldn't have the unity of everything directed toward le'bar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kol ma shebar HaKadosh Baruch Hu be'elomeh le'bar l'chveidei. That everything is directed b'chol derechecha de'ehu, b'chol masach l'shem shamayim, directed toward a goal. On the other hand, if you only had the echad, and everything was just one, you wouldn't have tachtenim, you wouldn't have a structure. So in essence, the challenge is how then in Seder Hishtalshilus do you do both? On one hand, create such fascinating division, meaning a structure of separate entities, diverse entities, at the same time that they all understand they have to work together. Now, obviously, when it comes down to Elam Hazeh, Hagashmi, where we are, we have the potential to do that, but it's much more complicated here because of our bchira, and that's why you see, Taka, the whole concept of machlekes and divisiveness is a result of ischalkus without ischalus. So in that context, I'm going to we began last week talking about Adam Kadmon, because the first Elam, so to speak, the first domain after the Tzimtzum and the Rishimu and the Kav, the first thing that God creates, so to speak. So I began giving a little overview of Adam Kadmon, or Ak, and I want to take it further. And what I'm going to talk about now is this point that I just gave in this introduction. And it's based on, again, I didn't post it, but I'll give you the Marmikemis. There's a lot of Marmikemis on this, but the most fundamental ones I'm going to use now is Kisove Tov, both in Hemshech Hayim Beis, where he brings together the Sugi of Ak from all the different Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and Reb Marash, and in Sovei Tofrei Shayin Gimel. And the second is the Maimorim of Masei and Dvorim Tofrei, Sovei Tofrei Shayin Beis, and the next is Masei and El Masei and El Advorim Tofrei Shayin Gimel. In the earlier versions, it's all in Chelik Aleph. Today, I think the new edition is probably in different chalach, I'm not sure. But that's what I'm going to base a lot what I'm saying right now. And as I said, there in the Marmikemis, you could see its Seichen is based on B'Yuri Azeir and other places from Chassidus. And the real question is, what is the role of Adam Kadmon? And if you didn't have it, what would be missing? Which is always a good, I say trick, but it's a good way, Evan HaBeichen, to understand something in Chassidus. Always ask yourself, what would it be if that thing didn't exist? Let's say if there's no Chochmah, everything started from Bina, what would be missing? Or if there's no Bina. So it's a lot easier to understand something when you think of it if it was missing, what would be missing from the whole picture? So in the earlier Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, and definitely in Kabbalah, it doesn't always say, the Alter Rebbe sometimes does it, but it doesn't always tell you, it just talks about, let's say, Ak or any other level and tells you what it is. But the Rebbe Rashab does speak in those terms. What does it do? That, so to speak, if you didn't have Ak, what would exist, what would be missing? So in the first Maimon I just referred to, Savei Ayin Gimel, he asked the question, and that once you know that there's Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and we learned about that, I discussed it, that basically is the field of energy, so to speak, the divine energy that would be the first place where Metzias Nimtza, where Atzmus is built in Metzias Nimtza, manifests in the Metzias Nimtza through Oyer. But Oyer is completely poshet betachlis apshitas, which means it's completely seamless. But at the end of the day, after the Tzimtzum, we talked about the Igul HaGadol, there is a Makif. It's called Makif Kloli of the Igul HaGadol, sometimes referred to as Tehiri Law. From the Zohar I mentioned, Bereish Ramanissa de Malka, Golev Gelif, but Tehiri Law. That Tehiri Law is usually interpreted as the Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, what I referred to last week as Atzilus de Klolos. So once you have that, what do you need to have Ak? What does it accomplish that the so-called the Makif HaKloli of the Igul HaGadol or Tehiri Law does not accomplish? And for that, and for the record, this level is called Tehira Tata, Ak, generally speaking. So he explains in that Maimon Kisove that the Makif before the Tzimtzum is L'mayla Hishtalshilus. So it doesn't, even though it's necessary from the point of view of Das Elyon, from the Eibishter, but as far as impact on our existence, it doesn't have a direct impact. Whereas Ak is in Seder Hishtalshilus, is the beginning of Seder Hishtalshilus. And he speaks very specific impact that Ak has on our existence. But he first makes it clear the impact, however, is not nirgish by us. We don't feel it. And that's where he brings the famous question, how is it that the Eibishter could know Yediyah and Bechira? How the Eibishter knows everything. Like it says in the Mishnah, Hakol Tzofay, Varashus Nesuna, which is all the Mefarshim, it seems like a contradiction. If God knows everything, so how is there Rashus, Bechira, for us to do anything? Whatever we do, God knows already. So he brings there the classic answer is that the idea does not affect us because it's on God's terms and it doesn't have any impact on us. So in other words, we're choosing at our own volition, and the Eibishter happens to know what's going to happen, but it's not that his idea affects our Bechira. If the Eibishter made a Gzeira and said that you must be, God forbid, a Rosha or a Tzaddik, that would be a Stira to Bechira. But the Eibishter knows beforehand what you're going to choose, it's not. So I'm not going to go into the whole discussion, it's a whole other topic. The Eibishter's idea affects us. So this explains, no, it doesn't, especially in this moment. It doesn't affect us. Because the Eibishter could choose that his idea should not affect. The Rebbe gives an example for it, which is really based on the Ravid and the Rambam that talk about this question. Just like a Yedei Chassidus. If somebody happens to be a Novi, or somebody knows the future, does that mean he's affecting the future? It means that the future is affecting his idea, Kedem HaMais. In other words, he happens to see what's going to be tomorrow. Just like some people know from what happened yesterday, he knows what's going to happen tomorrow, but it's not he's impacting what's going to happen tomorrow. Anyway, I don't want to digress. I know this is a topic of its own and needs to be spoken about. I just want to talk in the context of Ak. So basically what he says there is that Ak is a level, and I mentioned last week, Er Kloli is the Lashon that the Alter Rebbe says the Magid would use very often. He said this as Meragle Bepume, meaning he would say it often that Ak is a Er Kloli. The example being like Moshe Rabbeinu was shown Ad Hayem HaAchrin. It says Ad Hayam HaAchrin, Ad Hayem HaAchrin, which means that he saw everything that would happen in history. But he saw it like a bird's eye view. It would be just like you have a bird that looks down, sees something we can't see because we only see the mokim where we are. An example I often give for this is, let's say you're riding on a boat in a river. So you're on the boat, so you could see the banks of the river. You see what's here. It's here. Then, as the boat continues down the river, what you saw yesterday is already past, and tomorrow you don't know what you're going to see until you get there. Now, imagine a bird is on your shoulder. in the boat. So then the bird sees what you see. But then the bird takes flight and it's flying above. It could see what you're going to see tomorrow because the bird has now a bird's eye view. Because it's not just seeing the mokim that is in your range of vision. You can see also the part of the river down the river, which you haven't yet reached to. Just a dugman. So if you think of the guf as being you on the boat, and the bird like the neshama, in a way the neshama has a vision bigger than just mokim, the moment of zman, which is ovar, heva, and osid, or mokim, milo, mato, or this place and that space. Now we don't know that because we don't have eyes of a neshama. But if you think about it, what a real Navi is, it's not such a miracle. If a person is able to go to that place, which is l'mayla mizman and mokim, his looks, they'll be able to see more than most people see. Just like you say, Ezu chacham areyas haneled. So what does that mean? The wise person sees the birthing. Most of us, you look at something, you see what happened. But a smart person understands the teitzos that will come tomorrow. You say, how did he know what's going to be tomorrow? Because he's trained. It's not a miracle. A trained person knows that if you do this today, the consequences will be so and so. It's not that he's machriach it, it's just the way Siba Mesubav works. You do certain things, that's what trained people know. You go to a doctor, who's a trained doctor, they'll say if you behave a certain way, this is going to be the consequences. Now, could it be different? Of course it could be. He's a human being, can make a mistake. But the point is, our wise, experienced people can tell you things because they learn through trial and error what happens when you do a Siba Mesubav, cause and effect. So in a sense, in the bigger picture, using that mashal, let's go back to Ak. So Ak is that type of bird's eye view. I mentioned the sacred Hakel V'skira Achas. The Eibishter sees everything in one glance. The Loshen is from Hayem Yem about Ashgacha Pras, that when a leaf turns over, it's Ola b'machshava Akduma da Ak. Why Ak? Why not Achshava Akduma da Atzilus? Because Atzilus is already in a much more, it's not, in that sense, it's not Skira Achas. Atzilus is already a Ruchnisdik world, but it's a world of structure. So Ak is structure as well, but it's the structure that sees everything like a klal. So that's the first point he makes. But then he asks, or then he explains, what impact does it have on us? Okay, fine, the Eibishter has this bird's eye view. Moshe Rabbeinu saw till the end of time. Adam Arishan also did. It said Adam Arishan was able to see Mitsefe Elam at Sefe. Most of us can only see a certain amount of space, as far as your eyes can see. But these people were able to see a bigger picture. So what might have come into us? So he says, so Ak has an effect on us, except again, we don't feel its effect, but the Teitzah you feel. And he gives a few examples of what the effects are. The first is bittul. The concept of bittul in existence, he says, comes from Ak. Because Ak sees the whole picture and is not therefore defined by the details, by the klal, in a way, it's mamshich in us also a sense of bittul that our mitzias is not kol kulei. In other words, if there was no Ak, we wouldn't have the inyan of bittul in existence. Now you can say, isn't that the role of oir? Yes, that is the role of oir. But remember, oir lifnei tzimtzum is lifnei tzimtzum. That oir had to be nisamtzum, be concealed. But la'achar tzimtzum, so to speak, you could say Ak embodies the concept of bittul, and that's why taka in Ak, the main focus is the klal, not the prat. It sees everything, but it sees it all, b'skira achas. So Ak's impact on us is the aved when we have bittul, like he gives an example of Hagdomas Naisel and Nishma, that he says that power comes from Ak. That's one thing he says. The other thing he says, the power of Mesiris Nefesh also comes from Ak. That a person has Mesiris Nefesh, which is not al piseichel, it's l'mayla meseichel. Why would your person give off his life? Now, Mesiris Nefesh, Mesiris Harotzen, doesn't have to mean physical life. It could be person dedication. He says that goes against the human nature that a person takes care of themselves. Again, comes from the power of Ak. So essentially, the role of Ak in this sense, in Hishtalshilus, is it infuses in the structure that will come afterwards. All the levels, Akudim, Nekudim, all the way, Bri Yitzir Asiyah, Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiyah, all the way to our world, what will happen is that in it is embedded the seed of Bittul and a Mesiris Nefesh. That's the points in Kisave Ayin Gimel. which is quite fascinating because it means, even though we may not know it's coming from Ak, but it means Ak is active in our lives. And if you take away that, you don't have that Yichud Kloli and Bittel and Mesiras Nefesh. So even though I don't think he says it beferish mamish, but I go back to my introduction today about Ischalkus and Hishtalshilus, in many ways, Ak creates the ability to have Hishtalshilus. Because if you didn't have Ak, and you'd, let's say, jump straight from the Kav to Atzilus, or even not Atzilus, Akudim, then you would not have a place where all the Protim work together. In Ak, since Ak is like a vision of all of existence, like a bird's eye view, and everything is united there, so then it makes sense that when the structure will begin to emerge, it will be infused with this element, this Nekudas Hakloli, that connects it all. Think of it in a different way. I mentioned a good dogma for all of this is always Bepsarech Zalika, the development of a fetus, of a child, from the moment of conception to the moment of birth. So at birth we know a child is a full-blown entity, still a tiny, but everything is there, a healthy child, all the Ramachevarim, Shasagidim, and Baruch Hashem, that's the birth of a healthy child. But it didn't begin that way. It began all in one cell. It's one cell. By the time a child, after 9 months, you're talking about trillions of cells. They say there's between 35 trillion and 75 trillion cells in the human being. Trillion. It's a pretty big number. They're not even sure what number it is. But it's definitely up there. And it all began with one cell, like one seed. So you look at a tree, that can be a mighty redwood tree, these trees that are growing already for 1,000 years. And yet it all began with one seed. Why did Abish to make it like that? So the reason is because he wanted Ardus in Ischalkus, he wanted Hishtalshilus in Ardus, and it should make sense. If it right away became a tree, that's a mighty tree, or a child was just conceived as a full-blown child, you'd have the Hishtalshilus. But you need a miracle for it to work together. Since the development of a child begins, everything begins together in one cell, one concentrated nucleus. So then as it splits apart, and the cell will split into 2, and then into 4, into 8, and ultimately in trillions, all those trillion cells all once one part of one. And since it's part of one, that creates that they all recognize an Achdus to listen to each other. That in a way is the secret behind how could there be Hishtalshilus in a world of Ischalkus. Because that's the way the Eibishter made it, and it makes total sense. So to bring it, push it to a simple example. Someone will say a question, people ask a question, how could we expect that there should be world peace? Say Mashiach will come, le'kina v'le'sachrus, le'hirav, le'melchama, le'kina v'le'sachrus, Molar is Deus Hashem, le'yirei v'le'yashchisu. How is it possible? Ein Deus Ein Shabbos. And okay, that fine. Ein Deus Ein Shabbos, you still could have Vesvav Besufa, you could have Shammai and Hillel are at peace with each other, even if they disagree. But we see in history, the Ein Deus Ein Shabbos ended up being far worse than that. The diversity became divisiveness. And divisiveness became Mulchama, which is why in B'yem Sheni of Maaseh Bereshis, it doesn't say Kitev. Because even though it's the B'riyah of the Eibishter, how could it be not Kitev? Because Begoli, it's the birth of Hishtalshilus, by Yavdel, the Nekiah. The Havdalah has potential to create Machlekas, and that's what the Medrash says, Nivra Machlekas in Yom Sheni. Was there actual Machlekas? No, but the potential for Machlekas. Yom Shlishi is Tiferes, Hishtalshilus, Kosav Ashlishi, Bo Kosav Ashlishi, Machriya Beineim, between the Shnei Ksuvim, Machishim Zeh. So in other words, then you have Huchbal Beikitev. So you could ask a question, if the nature of existence is Hishtalshilus, and the Eibishter made it that Ein Deus Ein Shabbos, people don't have the same opinion, to the point that then you can have Kol Dal and Gvar, whoever's stronger, survival of the fittest, fighting, divisiveness, and war. And this is not a Kasal Kedaitach. My Sadav, look at history. How many wars have been fought? Between individuals, between communities, and between nations. Thank God there's less than it was once. So, B'derech HaTeva, how could you expect peace? That would be a good question. So the only answer you could have, is it's a miracle. The Eibishter will make a miracle. But we all know in Semchan Al Hanes, and the whole point of Dira B'Tachtenim is not to rely on miracles. So but implanting and creating Hishtalshilus in a way that it all begins with one cell, with one skira achas, in Ak, Eir Kloli, that answers it al piteva. That be'etzem people, even though we're divided, in the sense not say divided, even though we're diverse and different, but we also, just as we are built in to have Ein Deis Ein Shavis, we're also built into us a certain achdus. And that's why you see, people can love each other even though they're very different. People could have avos achim. People could do things for each other that even if it's at their own expense. So at the same time you see people have been selfish and they've hurt other people, but you also saw people with unbelievable nobility and self-sacrifice and giving their life for another person. That means because in our nature, that's the key. It's not a miracle. In our nature is the element of separation. Because that's how the Eibishter wanted, like I said, with the human body. But there's also a phenomenal amount of unity. So the question is not how is it going to happen. The question is how do we reveal the inherent achdus that comes from Ak within Seder Hishtalshilus, or I'm speaking within the human race. You're not looking to achieve something new. You're looking to achieve bimagala, something that's there already. In other words, people, when they work together, it also serves their self-interest. Many people think, the only way I can satisfy my needs is by stepping on someone else. It's not true. Working with someone, they can help you and you can help them. That's called Hishtalshilus. Each one helps each other. In a healthy marriage, the difference between a healthy and unhealthy marriage, a healthy marriage is still two different people. It's not like you find in a healthy marriage that people have one opinion, but they know how to use their differences to complement each other and grow. In an unhealthy situation, their differences become cause for tension and aggravation and ultimately conflict. So it's not like in a healthy marriage, suddenly everybody loses their opinion, there's no more differences. Just like in a healthy body. It's not like every part of the body suddenly loses its identity. Chas v'sholem. That also would be destructive. It has its identity, but also recognizes a deeper element that we mentioned before, that Ak introduces, called bittul. Bittul is not a stira to this distinction. Bittul is not a stira to Hishtalshilus. Bittul plus Hishtalshilus equals Hishtalshilus, basically. So Ak introduces the bittul, the achdus, and that's the beginning of the whole Seder Hishtalshilus starts with that fundamental state, a unity, one cell. That will ultimately, as it breaks into details, those details will also never forget, and they always remember. They have embedded, so to speak, in their DNA, if you wish, in their very fiber of their existence, the hargosha, the hergish, whether they feel it begoli or not, but it's there, that they need to work together. And as I said, the best example is the human body, or nature for that matter. Look at nature. Fascinating how different creatures and different species, but how they also coordinate and work with each other. Okay, so that's a summary of Kisove in Beis. I want to go now to the other two Maimorim I mentioned, Masei and Dvorim Ayin Gimel. So there, he takes this point and takes it further and asks a question. He says, all the elements of Seder Hishtalshilus all serve one role, or I shouldn't say one role, say one particular objective, and that is to be a mamutza, an interface. Atzilus is an interface between higher than Atzilus and lower than Biyah. So every element is an interface. So you ask the question, what is Ak's role as an interface, as a mamutza that's different than Atzilus or other levels in Hishtalshilus? So there he says an interesting thing, which I already touched upon, but I want to elaborate more. And he brings the Rashi in Bereshis, that the way the Eibishter created the world, like I just said, with a cell, was also the same way. Asana Maimoris Nivra Elam, but everything was created on day one. In Bereshis Bara Lakim, which is Nami Maimeru, is a Maimer Kloli, which associates with Ak, and in it, you have already Biskalos, the whole creation. So what the Eibishter created in each day of creation was what? He brought up an Aklal El Aprat. So what he discusses there is that the mamutza of Ak, he says, is not a mamutza between L'mayla Hishtalshilus and Hishtalshilus, or a mamutza between Ein Sof and Ivroim, like let's say Atzilus is, and also Atzilus the Klolos, Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. But Ak's role is a mamutza in existence itself, in Ivroim itself, between Klal and Prat. That's what he explains there, in detail. That Ak, everything is in a form of a Klal, and the worlds afterwards are in a form of a Prat. But Ak also has Pratim, because Ak has Sfiras as well, but they're still all within the Klal. That's what he elaborates there in those Maimorim there. So it's an interesting point, because what he's saying really is that it's not just about connecting the Eibishter with Elimus and Welt, but it's also in Elimus itself. You constantly have this mamutza at work. So in other words, you don't have to always jump to Bli Gvul. Even in the world of Gvul, there's a Gvul that's in a form of a Klal, and then there's a form of a Prat. And he brings there with Zman and Mokim that I mentioned before. Zman like a Klal. Let's say Rosh Hashanah, for example. So we learned that Rosh Hashanah, why is it called Reish Hashanah, not Chilus Hashanah? Because the Reish, like the Reish HaAdam, is not just the beginning of your body, it also is Kael, is the central nervous system that encompasses your entire being. So the same thing, Reish Hashanah in Zman, is Kael Kol HaZman of the entire year. That's why every second on Rosh Hashanah is so precious, because it's not just a second, it's a second that encompasses the entire year. You make a achlot on Rosh Hashanah, and your destiny, and the din of mishpat of Rosh Hashanah is al Kol Hashanah Kula. So there's a Zman Klal, and then the rest of the year is the Pratim. So it's like the Reish, and then the Pratim of the body. And the Reish itself is also in that level. So in that sense, Ak, you could say, is the Reish HaKlali, or like he calls it, the Chochmah Klolis. So just like in every Elam, there's Chochmah of Atzilus, Chochmah of Bria, where also Chochmah is also like a Reish, but that's already in the Spheres and in each Elam. So to speak, the Reish Klali is Ak. So it's like the Reish Hashanah in Zman and Rosh Hashanah in Mokim, Reish HaMokim of all Zman and Mokim. And then he continues and says that there's also Chitzenius Ak and Pnimius Ak, which I want to touch upon now. What's the difference between the two? So Chitzenius Ak, like everything again, because a mamutza has to be powerful and effective, the Chitzenius of something relates more to the Prat, and the Pnimius relates more to the Klal. So to use an example that he uses there, Keser, has Arich and Atik. Now, Arich is called Reish HaNetzolim, the beginning, the head, Reish, of the emanations. In other words, let's say Keser of Atzilus. So the Reish HaNetzolim of Atzilus would be Chochmah Bina Das, all start with Arich, which is the lower Chitzenius of Keser. Atik is called Pnimius HaKeser. Atik is from the word Atik Yemen, Netak, V'nivdal, it's removed. And you need both. It's like think of a teacher, a brilliant teacher teaching a student. So there's the part of the teacher that he relates to the student, and the student relates to the teacher. That's like the Arich within the teacher. The Atik within the teacher is that which remains above the head of the student. The student realizes, yes, I understand some things, but there are many things that I don't understand, that remain above my head. So there's an element that's netak, and that's also necessary. In good learning, when you learn something well, you need to understand, but you also have to know there's more to understand. And if you think you have it all figured out, that's not that's a contradiction to growth in learning. Now, a real good teacher is able to balance the two. They help you understand things, but also you always see that there's more. It's like climbing a ladder. You always see there's something higher. So the same thing in Hishtalshilus, the Eibishter made it that way, that everything works in this relative way. You grow as far as you can, then you go and see the next step. In Aveda, for example, we say every day in Shema, V'haftas Hashem Elokecha. Doesn't jump right away to B'chol Moedecha, B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Moedecha. Now if you have B'chol Moedecha, why don't you say, what do you need B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha? It doesn't work that way. It's like someone says, I think out of the box, but you first have to have a box before you think out of the box. You first have to have, you can't jump beyond yourself if you haven't gone as far as you could do. Once on Purim, Somebody got shikar. He was behaving in a little, let's call it childish way. So the Rebbe was like, by Fabring and Purim. So the Rebbe was like, saw that. So someone said to the Rebbe, "Erhal by Adel Yoda." That's what he said. It was just like, so the Rebbe said, "Friya dafman hom Yoda, edem hat Adel Yoda." So someone's held by, you can't just jump to Adel Yoda without first having Yoda. You have to first have your das, and then you can become L'mayla Medas. The point is that everything is not Seder v'Hadroga. So Chitzenius Ak, which is another, I said before, it's like Chochmah Kloli, also Ak is called Keser Kloli as well. Because it's the Ratzon Kloli, like I said, the blueprint or the bird's eye view. So the Ratzon Kloli. So Ak also has Chitzenius of Ak, is like the Arich of Seder Hishtalshilus. This is a language from my modern. And Primius Ak is the Atik of Seder Hishtalshilus. And the Maimonim explain, especially there in Ayin Gimel, Dvarim, Maseh and Dvarim Ayin Gimel, that Ak, the Primius Ak is right near the Reishis HaKav. Remember the Kav that comes right after the Tzimtzum. The Reishis HaKav is the most intense part. So the Eitz Chaim says that's Ke'ein Atika Ogaba Galgalta, that even though Atik hasn't yet really formed in the full sense of the word, but the Reishis HaKav is like Atik, and Maimonim explained that's the Primius Ak connects to that. So if you think of it, I don't want to speak in Gashmis again because we're not talking about physical space, but in Inyan, Primius Ak is like, touches the higher levels of the beginning of the Kav, and there's Chitzenius Ak, which relates to what comes below. So even when you talk Klal and Prat, we have the Klal, Ein Klal el Masha bePrat, Ein Prat el Masha beKlal. So there's the Prat sheba Klal, there's the Klal sheba Prat. Even in Halacha, in Nigla. So Ak has both. It's the Klal, but it's a Klal that relates to the Pratim. That would be the outer dimension of Ak. And there's the Pratim, how they are more encompassed and they relate to the Klal, which is the Primius of Ak. And one more point, and then I think I'll conclude the Ak discussion. And that is that you may see Chassidus commonly referred to Igulim of Ak or Yesher, Igulim and Yesher. So I want to just touch upon that. I think I mentioned it already in one of the shiurim, but so Igulim and Yesher is the Kabbalistic version of saying Sevav and Mamala. Exactly the same thing. Igul is a circle, Yesher is a line. Or another way we call it Makif and Pnimi. As we know, these are two forces, two tracks that the Eibishter created. Mamala Kalam, Sevav Kalam, or Sevav Kalam, Mamala Kalam, Makif Pnimi, Igulim and Yesher. In Eitz Chaim, you're going to see mostly the Lashon Igulim and Yesher, or maybe Makif and Primi sometimes. Sevav Mamala, even though it's from Zehar, but that Chassidus uses more that language. But it's interchangeable. And the first place when Eitz Chaim talks, since I've been quoting the Eitz Chaim back when we spoke about the Ein Sof, Lifnei Tzimtzum, then the Tzimtzum, and the Reshimu, and the Kav. So what does he say? If you remember, I quoted the Eitz Chaim, he said that the Kav, which is Yesher, Kav is a line. It comes from the Igul Hagadol. So there you have Yesher and Igul. And I once wrote an article that, in computer language, everything is zeros and ones. A zero is an Igul, and one is a Yesher, is a line. So everything Yesher is Igulim and Yesher. So the Kav, it says, the Zohar says, a Kav Nimshach v'chezer u'misagel. So the Kav suddenly turns into a circle. It's like the paintbrush. You're painting, but you're not painting a line, it creates an eagle. And then he says the Kav is nimshach further and creates a second eagle until there's 10 igulim. So the Kav creates the igulim now, even though eagle is higher than Kav, but it's the Kav that creates the igulim, Bepel. It brings it into Bepel. And which igulim are these first 10 igulim? It's called igulim of Ak. Igule Ak. The makifim of Ak. The Sevav Kalam of Ak. But there's also Yesher in Ak. But Yesher, in a way you could say, the Igul is a klal and the Yesher is a prat. Because the Kav is a line that has Milo Mata, higher and lower, conceptually. Eagle, there's no Milo Mata in the eagle. What's the top of an eagle? What's the bottom of an eagle? Nowhere, you can't point it out. That's why the Alter Rebbe says, that famous question, and Hayem Yem is brought from a Maimah from the Alter Rebbe, Tavkuf Samach Beis. He writes, why the people in America don't fall off the earth. Remember, the Alter Rebbe lived in the Chetzi Kader Elyon, where Eretz Yisrael is. in the where Russia is the same Chetzi Kader as it's so. Why do Anshe America not fall off the earth? So he says the scientists say the reason is the Chachmei HaTeva because there's a Koyach HaMashiach that everything is drawn to its basically gravity. Some argue whether he means gravity or something else, but upon him that everything is nimshach ela offer. And he says the real biur is because the oretz is an eagle, and it's nimshach from Megulim, and Megulim there's no Maila Mata, but mainly you don't fall off. For them, Maila is above their head, so the earth is there. For us, the Maila is above our. In other words, in an eagle, everybody's on top, essentially. There's no such thing as a bottom. That's how he explains it, without going into the details. Chassidus explains eagle sometimes like a niggin. A niggin in Inyan doesn't have an end. We stop at some point. But a niggin, you keep going, and if you keep singing, it's not like you feel that, we came to the end, then you're starting again. It's true, it has different tenuas, and there's a point where the niggin, you're middle of the niggin. But a niggin is considered like an eagle, like a mochel. The tzaddikim, a mochel, like a circle, and the circle doesn't have a top or a bottom. As a matter of fact, the Rebbe's grandfather in his Pirush on Seder, I forgot the name right now. No, he asked. What's his name? Pirush on Seder. Shara Kel. He says he asked the question: why do we say Atkan Akofa Aleph Simchas Torah? Why Atkan? So he answers because Akofa is an eagle, and the eagle has no mile mat, and if you don't say Atkan, you'll never stop. So you need to say Atkan to make Hagbola because the eagle is just going to be Nimshach forever. That's what he says. Akaponim, so the Makifim of Ak essentially is the Klal, because in the Makif there's no Milo Mata. The Yesher of Ak is the Prat. So there you have Chetzenius Ak relates more to the Yesher, Pnimius Ak relates more to the Kelel, which is the Klal, the Makif. And there you have how Ak's role plays out in Seder Hishtalshilus that allows to have the bittul, like I said, Mesiris Nefesh, Nasa V'Nishma, in a world of Hishtalkus and Pratim and structure. So that covers Ak, and we'll stop here. Everyone have a very pleasant day.